Welcome to the afternoon session, session 3, the way forward, identifying appropriate responses to challenges and donor support. Actually, I must say that we are entering probably the most dramatic part of our conference. Of course, if we can believe those media reports from the North Korea, because after this luncheon, I mean, we would be quite susceptible to get asleep, especially in this kind of the very ambient atmosphere in this room. So, the only thing that can save us from the tragic fate being shot by the anti-aircraft gun is that discussion is really vivid, the discussion is interesting, and we, all of us, or most of us, would be prepared to engage in this discussion and to contribute. So, with this short introduction, I would like to pass the floor to Gunnar Wiegand, our moderator for this afternoon session, who is Director for Russia, Eastern Partnership, Central Asia, Regional Cooperation, and OSCE in the European External Action Service, person who was very instrumental in bringing Latvia's presidency as far as we get now actually in the areas related to the Eastern Partnership and also on Central Asia, which were two of our geographic priorities. So, Gunnar.
Thank you very much. Okay. Thank you very much for this possibility to moderate this panel. I'm here because of my geographic function in the European External Action Service for the East, to use one word for it. But as a former spokesman for a couple of years, I'm delighted to be in this media conference, and I'm also delighted to inform you that with quite some encouragement of Latvian presidency and encouragement ultimately of all our foreign ministers and the European Council, our heads of state and government, we are also taking some new steps to answer some of the communication challenges which are new. And that means that we are now establishing a strategic communications team in the European External Action Service with active support of the various EU institutions and of a number of member states who will second communication experts to it in order to communicate more effectively and in different ways about our policies in a way that this is reaching citizens as opposed to only journalists, in a way that this is concrete as opposed to being in Euro jargon, and in a way that we can also disarm manipulations and lies which are being put out almost every day in this information space, which includes, of course, not only your countries, which includes other countries like the very big country called the Russian Federation, but also our own countries, because this information challenge exists everywhere. Too many myths have been created, and we will try to respond better to that, and will also establish a network of communicators in all of our member states for this purpose. The European Council in March also asked us to establish an action plan on how to communicate more effectively and deal with the communication-related challenges, and this will be presented by the High Representative Vice President Mogherini to the heads of state and government in June. So this as a brief introductory remark as regards what we are doing on top of the normal work in Brussels together with our member states. But I'm now pleased to open the panel discussion on the key question, which is the way forward, identifying appropriate responses to the challenges and to the donor support, which responses are appropriate when looking at the challenges which you all have discussed here this morning already, whether they are internal challenges in countries which have non-transparency about ownership, in countries where there is a lack of media freedom in some cases, in situations where we have strong external interference, and we have to have a variety of responses. Yesterday evening there was a presentation by the European Endowment for Democracy on a part of those possible responses, and we are trying to focus on this from different angles now. And I would like to introduce first Mr. Mogens Bjerregård, President of the Steering Committee of European Federation of Journalists, who would like to share with us his main impressions from the morning and what it means for the definition of the appropriate responses. Please, Mogens.
Thank you very much, and thank you for inviting me here. And I also want to thank the speakers today to be very firm on the serious challenges for journalists and media in this part of the world. I'm not going to repeat all what has been said about journalists risk to be killed, go to jail, and be violated. But it's in that world we are discussing and sitting and trying to find solutions. One step forward on this was presented by Nils Muiznieks this morning when he told about the platform that we as European Federation of Journalists have been involved in. And I thank you for promising to make noise, because this is also a way forward to make noise when these situations are there. Just a few figures I can tell you. It was launched this spring, and we have already reported 49 alerts. 39 alerts alone from the European Federation of Journalists from 15 countries. Looking at what is the what are the challenges if we are trying to build the bridge from the morning to the afternoon. It has already been addressed that the owners of the media outlets must be able to make a business. We know that. It's also very important that the journalists can make a living out of making journalism. Because if they cannot make a living out of making journalism, you won't get decent journalism. It's quite simple. So salaries and working conditions are very important. We must have high-ranked educational environment for journalists. That must be addressed in all countries, mid-career training as well. And I'll come back to that part, we must have an environment for subsidizing independent media, including public service broadcast, ensuring editorial freedom. And I know that in some countries it is very difficult to differ between support from states subsidizing and be a free media. But that's the way forward. We have had this in many countries, and it should be possible. Coming back to the journalists, we have seen in several countries that trade union leaders find themselves expelled when they do their duty as professional leaders. This must be addressed. This must be changed. The authorities must take care of that it is okay to be a union leader, and they should have a decent way to do their work as union leaders, because it's so important to have strong organizations. This is one of the things that you, both on employers' side and on the employees, we must have strong organizations in all the countries, because they can provide better environment for media and for the journalists. We also have the situation that media owners reject bargaining and prefer to replace more and more staff by using freelancers individually and lower paid. This must also be addressed. It must be discussed, and you must find a way out of this, because if you don't find a way out of this, it will be difficult to make decent and good quality journalism. Sometimes we are facing that freelancers cooperating are accused to make cartels. It's really a bizarre situation that small freelancers are accused to make cartels when they are trying to deal with big companies. It's crucial that media owners, that employers and employees work together. They find them together, they go into dialogue, because if you don't go into dialogue, it's very difficult to not only to find solutions, but also to carry them through. So what we should do is to establish, or if they're not there, establish, if they're there, strengthening Publishers and Broadcasters Association, and strengthen, or if necessary, rebuild journalist unions. It should be one of their key elements for supporting, for donors to deal with in these countries. And you have to reach out to the new professionals in journalism, as you will find journalism in a lot of new places today than it was in the old days. Journalism is not only taking place at the old school media. We must reach out to all of them. We must build institutions to take care and focus on further education, mid-career training. And it struck me today, and I heard about it yesterday as well, that that was at a meeting in Oslo, that the language skills is a challenge for a lot. So it should take care of that. When you cooperate, you can get better influence on the media policy in the country. From my own country, where I'm coming from Denmark, we are cooperating very much, the employers and employees. We are cooperating to influence on the media policy, and we succeed in it. And we succeed because we are very strong united. To be strong united, you can much better influence on the political level. We changed the subsidized system in Denmark by being united and going together, and also sit together in the committee set up by the Minister of Culture. So you can do it if you are working in that way together. It's also when you're talking about the educational sector, you should also stick together. Go hand in hand and ask for being a part of the boards on the universities or the journalist schools. Be a part of it. Go into it. And because if employers and employees can show together that they can work together and get results, it's much easier to cooperate with donors, to cooperate with other stakeholders, because you have already showed that you can make a difference. When you can show you can make a difference, I'm sure it's much easier to go further that way. And looking at what sort of donors we can have, we know a lot of different donors, but there are some players out there that should contribute much more to what we are doing as media and journalists. And that's the IT companies, it's the telecom companies, it is the big, really big players as Google, Amazon, Disney, you name them. They live on what we are producing. They live for free on what journalists and media are producing. We must find a way so they can contribute to the development of the media, to the development of the content that they, in fact, are living from. It must be, and they must understand that it should be made in a way so it is keeping the principle of arm's length. Keeping the principle of arm's length is fundamental, both in such a situation and when you are talking about subsidizing media. when you are talking about license for public service, keeping the principle of arm's length is crucial, important, because if not, we don't get any way further. It's really, it's so important. So my message here is to be more cooperative, go more in dialogue, go hand in hand, be able to make differences, to make the difference together. Let's meet the media who really have the possibility to support this area. I think that's crucial. And why, this is the last thing I'm saying now, why it is so important to subsidize media in a lot of small countries. This is the only way to make sure that you can have the pluralistic media in all countries and across the region as well. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mogens, for this passionate plea for more solidarity and unity on the one side, but also more outreach to business, from business and other donors for a pluralistic media landscape. All of this in dialogue and cooperation and not in confrontation. We have the next speaker who must know a lot about dialogue in a difficult media environment, because he is the president of the Union of Journalists of Azerbaijan since a long time, and an experienced journalist, Mr. Arif Aliyev. Please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Я буду говорить.
I will speak Russian. Based on the topic of this session, I must probably start with the challenges. What challenges is media community facing right now in Eastern Partnership countries, and it suffers? Why does it suffer? Because I am persuaded that journalism is a profession that hasn't been changed for a long time in its tasks. I don't mean technological aspect. From this point of view, time continually holds us in harsh frame of change. But I want to say that in general terms, journalism doesn't care what spring there is out there. Prague, spring of '68, Crimea, or Riga, spring 2015. This is a profession whose tasks and goals cannot be compared to institutions of civil society, which are directly connected to the situation in a specific region or country. It's actually very dangerous, because it's constantly being done. And so 1 year ago, for example, there was a major state event where there were discussed new tasks or challenges, as we call it here, faced by Azerbaijani journalism. And you know what was proclaimed? That its tasks are to give patriotism, to protect statehood, and to work for citizens' conscience. So going this way, we risk to be turned into propaganda activists. Doesn't it happen in many countries with those cases we have so often mentioned here? Therefore, I will base my speech on challenges as professional challenges. The latest research that was mentioned here and conducted by journalist organizations of 6 countries of Eastern Partnership once again demonstrated that these main challenges are still the same: the freedom of speech, the independence and professionalism, and they are interlinked. If there is not first, there will not be the second. If the first 2 are not present, the third will not be present, but only in this exact order, because professionalism does not provide for independence and freedom. As the research that I've mentioned showed, a very interesting research, the difficulty and challenges also in the fact that the situation in Eastern Partnership countries is quite different in every country, and it has already been mentioned today. We are so different that it's even difficult to believe that just 30 years ago we were citizens of the same country, going through the same problems and through the same regrets. Despite all programs of cooperation and integration in the United Europe, our media are more and more different from each other. If today we can just generally say something about Belarus and Azerbaijan, then the main challenge is the freedom of expression. In Armenia, Ukraine is the independence of media. In Georgia and Moldova, the questions are more professional-wise.
Экономические проблемы, которые часто поднимаются.
Economic problems are often discussed, and various professional and ethics standards. This is also reflected in statements of international organizations. We can see the statement or the report of OSCE or the Council of Europe about Azerbaijan, and freedom of speech is always mentioned, as well as journalists put in jail. In Ukraine, we can see another topical question, the property and the ownership, the freedom from oligarchs. So there are always economic problems such as advertisement and monopolization and unfair competition. In this respect, I would like to say a few words as my friends asked me. Today we've already heard a statement about journalists put in jail in Azerbaijan, and there is something incomprehensible, because the same surnames, the same people, the same journalists are always mentioned by the foreign organizations, and we can hear statements about these people, but journalists who are not less professional and who did as much for the freedom of speech and for their profession, who face more problems are often forgotten. I would like to mention journalist Amir Kadyrov. You might have heard his surname. Despite a lot of efforts of local organizations, when preparing statements or when negotiating with the Azerbaijan government, this person is often forgotten. Based on the aforesaid, considering the different situation in these countries and increasing differences in the countries of European partnership, I'd like to answer the questions put on the agenda for this session. What can the European Union do to improve the media landscape in these countries, and what can be done to improve the support of professional and independent media sector? First of all, we need to differentiate these questions in order to solve them. As to professionalism in journalism, well, it is necessary to remember that ethical standards and management are of crucial importance in countries with a relatively stronger democracy, such as Georgia, forever, and it is completely useless in countries without independent media, such as Belarus, Azerbaijan, and Armenia. The low professionalism level and breach of standards, constant breach of standards, are political issues. These are not related to the lack of training of future journalists. even if such significant training and education is organized, they are rejected by the system. So the most efficient activities in the countries with a weaker democracy is direct support for the survivors, so to say, to help them transform the content into a new platform which will provide new possibilities. Several people have already mentioned today that under conditions when there are no independent media and there is no direct help for survival of independent media, their efficiency decreases significantly. For example, independent newspaper called Zerkalo Mirror in Azerbaijan was the largest Russian speaking newspaper in northern Caucasus 10 years ago. But when the newspaper lost its support, the newspaper was closed. It was closed recently, and this seriously affected the media landscape in the region. And there are interesting side effects. Recently, the editor-in-chief of the newspaper said that 6 months after this newspaper was closed, the sale of Russian newspapers from Russia increased by 20%. We need to provide support in order to ensure high quality analytic work, but we need consistency, we need consistent policy. A project is created, a network is established, and there are new projects that disappear in a year or stop working. A couple of years later, someone remembers about these products and they are renewed, and it goes on and on this way. The list of projects resembles to a symmetry of very good ideas, as these ideas are dead and are later on resurrected. In Azerbaijan, well, we know that the situation is different due to the fact that some deterioration is expected, and it is important to promote dialogue between media community and government. We need a dialogue, not an imitation of the dialogue. Government needed this dialogue in the very beginning after restoration of independence, because this was the way how they could establish relations with the West. So this allowed to increase the level of education of journalist trainings and media freedom of speech, etc. But when the government grew stronger and established its relations with Europe, with the West, this dialogue has been deteriorating. The last thing I would like to add, the European Union should not forget the fact that there must be awareness raising among the citizens what is a European Union and what will the integration into the European Union bring, because those who are against it are still very active, and then it is necessary to explain why we need Europe full of controversies, why we need these values, etc. This is something we can hear not only from Russian shows or channels. These questions are also asked in other countries of the European partnership, and in Azerbaijan, considering the fact that half of the population does not understand the advantages of this process personally for him or her, the percentage, the rate of the people believing that the European Union, the European organizations fight for their own interests, analytical interests, political interests, and at any time can be as unwilling, undesirable as Russia or any other country. So this is quite a strong opinion, and there are more and more people believing in it. So this is not an empty idea. There might be some facts this position is based on. Thank you. That's all I wanted to share with you.
For your differentiated picture on how to work in a difficult landscape, and your advice to create new platforms when certain platforms are not possible anymore, and your very interesting questions how to convey to citizens the need to have controversies, which is of course the essence of any pluralistic society, that there are controversies, and perhaps this is not attractive enough for countries which are looking in their majority for stability first and foremost. We will come back to this, and I want to encourage members of the panel and later on also you all to intervene in response to some of these theses which are put forward at the panel, or to put forward your questions to different individual panel members. For the moment, we will continue here until each one of them has put forward their contribution, and I would like to ask now Mr. Tarmu from Estonia, the president of the Organization of News Ombudsmen of the World. So all the ombudsmen which exist in the media you are representing, but you're also a professional journalist yourself and working with the Estonian public media. Therefore, I would like to ask you to, in particular, look also after the ethics of journalism, not only classic journalism, but also the ethics in the new communication world. Please.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Dear participants, let me start by explaining my two roles. Yes, it would be a real privilege indeed if all the media ombudsmen in the world would be represented by me today, but they are not. So there's a lot of them in the world, but should be more. I will get back to that later. But when I'm not attending a conference, or when I'm not representing the World Organization of Media Ombudsmen, then I have some work to do as well, which is that I work on a daily basis at the public broadcaster in Estonia, in Tallinn, as ombudsman. My work consists of handling feedback from viewers, listeners, and readers about journalism ethics problems. So when there's complaints from people about the content of the public media, then it's my duty to handle those complaints and to see whether they're justified, whether journalism ethics was violated, whether there was a problem of political bias or some mistakes, factual mistakes, or whatever kind of thing there may be. And also I have to analyze myself as ombudsman whether the, for instance, the news programming is done in a neutral and politically unbiased way. So my own observations as ombudsman also come in. But ombudsmen of the world, yes, are united in an organization which is called the Organization of News Ombudsmen, ONO. Today I would like to, one sort of key thing I'd like to do here now during my few minutes is to promote the idea of self-regulation. We have talked and we have heard a lot about state regulation, how sometimes in the Eastern Partnership countries governments are interfering in freedom of the media and so on. Difficult economic situations for the media occur actually everywhere, absolutely everywhere, because we have had some American newspapers which used to have media ombudsmen liquidating those positions, eliminating them for financial reasons, not because the government did anything, not in the United States, but for financial reasons. So, but let's concentrate for a few minutes on self-regulation and why I think also for Eastern Partnership countries and beyond, as the good phrase goes here, I mean the Baltic states, for example, why self-regulation is crucial. because it is a very good way of keeping politicians away from meddling in the media. If the media can prove to the public and to politicians that yes, we can adjust our own affairs ourselves, there is no need for you politicians to join in and write another media law or amend the existing media law. Scrap the media laws, I would suggest to you, actually. Get rid of them. In Estonia, we were lucky not to have a framework press law. We, of course, had the broadcasting law because you have to have a government agency to issue licenses for broadcasters. But we don't have a press law. Germany has a press law, an old press law. Yes, good traditions, good old country, but, you know, you need some refurbishment sometimes. Get rid of the press law. Of course, we need new laws these days because of the internet. Some legal regulation is required. But if we have strong self-regulation in the media, that's very useful. Some countries in the Eastern Partnership region have strong self-regulatory mechanisms in place, like press councils, media councils. Ombudsman institutions? I don't think so. I don't think that the fellow Baltic countries of Latvia or Lithuania have a media ombudsman yet. So I would encourage actually anyone, be they countries in the Eastern Partnership region or beyond, to think of creating a post of media ombudsman, particularly for publicly funded media. Because that's the crucial thing, that it's true that every one of us has an absolute right to demand the public media must fulfill my expectations. The money comes out of my pocket as taxpayer. So if the public media organization has an ombudsman, it's a very good buffer between the criticism that comes sometimes from politicians, sometimes from business people, sometimes from the audience, from media consumers simply. So that buffer between those who criticize public media, or any other media, private media as well, and on the other hand, the editorial team. So the media ombudsman is like a judge, standing a little bit aside, not involved in everyday media editorial decisions, but providing an extra guarantee of media freedom. And now some of you may say, particularly in the countries where there's a problem of government interference, that, well, we don't have political freedoms in the country, and what do we do with self-regulation? Yes, you can actually use it. You can use it. Because if the political situation in a country is bad or is getting too bad, you can't be politically free. But then there's other things, non-political topics. You must still exercise journalistic ethics. Like if you handle a complaint, or not a complaint, a story about two private persons having an argument with each other, you don't have the right as a journalist to take the side of one of them, but you have to give them equal proportion in the story. So you need to have those rules anyway. So why don't you create a system of how people can have their complaints handled freely, free of charge and quickly by the Ombudsman or by the Press and Media Council, rather than wait for another political party to make an amendment to the media law, creating more restrictions for the media. When I talked about the role of, or the work of the media ombudsman at the public broadcaster, then I will actually have, as ombudsman, I will have more work in front of me, which relates to the other big topic discussed during the conference here all the time. I think every speaker has used those words, which is the Russian propaganda. And my way of using it is that Russian propaganda has forced Estonia to create new Russian language TV channel in September this year, in 4 months' time. So that's like newsworthy, basically. News item. There have been discussions in the past, both in Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, but also now after the Ukraine-Russia conflict started, that we need to have something to counterbalance the propaganda. In Estonia, the population is 75% Estonian, 25% is non-Estonian. And every time there is some kind of a strange thing that the green men may come across the border, and how do the Russian-speaking people in Estonia react when someone says, let's create a TV channel for them. So the decision has now been taken that it will be there. But of course, I hope that the one risk that I see that it is not materialized, which is that a Russian language media outlet in some people's opinion, should be quite careful when criticizing the government of that country. So when it's an Estonian language media or Estonian language journalist criticizing the government, when it's viewed as he's performing the watchdog role. When it's a Russian language journalist criticizing the government, then always there is a politician or just a viewer who says, this Russian language journalist is playing into the hands of the Kremlin. He's just talking the same thing that we hear from Moscow, that our government is bad. So I hope that, a completely new Russian language TV channel in Estonia will not have this risk that the journalists who start working there will have to be overly careful and have to think twice before they perform their watchdog role. They should be doing it the way that any journalist is doing this in Estonia. So finally, I'd like to lift the spirits of all of you who think that self-regulation is too far away, is too long-term, which it is long-term actually. And that's why I'm saying, why don't you start it? It takes an awful lot of time for a press council or the Ombudsman institution to become an authority in their country. So if you don't do it tomorrow, it will take even more time for it to become an authority. So it should be started now. And I know what I'm talking about. I remember the times when people from Denmark, a colleague who was here actually yesterday and not today, unfortunately, they came to Estonia after the breakup of the Soviet Union to explain about media ethics, self-regulation. We were sitting there, as some of you do now, actually, and thinking, what is he talking about? And we just didn't want to listen to this, and we thought it's too premature for us, too early. We have to set up our newspapers as a business first, and then think about ethics, and all this kind of thing. But then, just quite soon we realized that actually there's a point in it, what they said, that create a press council. And we did create a press council. We did write a code of press ethics. We started paying attention to this as well. So I have to be thankful to those people who came early on. And I thought myself that it's premature. It's not premature. Start now. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your clear plea for self-regulation. And this is certainly something which many societies which have gone through transition from authoritarian rule to a free society have experienced this challenge, whether you need state authority or self-regulation. And coming from a country which has unfortunately brought many painful experiences to many of its neighbors, I can say the self-regulation in Germany does work quite efficiently indeed. I would like to pass on now the word to another professional of communication, but who is not a journalist, but who is helping to create journalists with her work in media management and the School of Journalism of Georgia, Professor Maia Mikashavidze. And I understand that the case of Georgia was discussed quite intensively this morning, and perhaps we can go beyond the case of Georgia and see which larger contributions for the overall discussion you would like to bring in looking for the right responses.
Thank you very much, Mr. Moderator. I'm glad and humbled at the opportunity to speak at this very important conference, and I think that this is our first response to the multifaceted challenge that we have in front of us. And now I will try to start my PowerPoint presentation, which, yes, it's already there. Okay, very good. And I will try to skip some of the slides because we need to be more fluid. We've discussed it at great lengths. Let me be very brief, and if I miss out on something very active and vocal, Georgian delegation will help complement point number one is that we face many challenges, and I even came up with the typology, and typology would be old and familiar challenges, and those are political pressures, economic pressures, violation of rights of journalists, to name but few. But also we have new challenges, and those are, of course, Russian propaganda, internet trolling, invasion of privacy, breakup of business models, digital switchover. So what we all agreed today, and I want to give credit to those who already expressed that idea ahead of me, is that these challenges warrant reassessment and enhancement of donors' response, and moreover, they require innovative solutions. So I'll try to take a step, and I'll start with the biggest challenge, of course, which is massive, well-targeted flow of disinformation coming from Russian language broadcasts. But like my colleagues already said, in Georgia, in Armenia, in some other countries, this disinformation is spread by local media, and disinformation is not always easily identifiable or traceable back to their sources. And we have used a very good term, anti-Western propaganda, for these lies. And response is needed for that, because we cannot shrug this type of disinformation as part of normal democratic discourse about Europe or the association process or the Eurasian Union, because it's not normal circumstances. We are faced with Russian propaganda, and we see commonness of sources, reliance on Russian sources. Anyway, we have challenge that is, some of it is explicit, coming in Russian language, and some of it is presented to us in Georgian language, and I think it's very dangerous, and we need to think about those types of threats as well. As to the response, I will not, of course, be the first to express this idea, but it is very important to deal with both sides of the communication cycle, if I may. We need to increase the volume and quality of fact-based information. At the same time, we need to boost media literacy and critical thinking skills on the part of the public. And what is also very important, to monitor media content so that we can pin down propaganda, and we can also notice any shifts in public opinion. We mentioned here how the number of Georgians who are sympathetic to Eurasian Union and kind of closer association with Russia has increased, and these processes go parallel with the increase in Russian propaganda on the territory of Georgia. So what we can do, what else can we do? I think we need to increase plurality in areas where they're missing. And in Georgia, we're speaking about ethnically populated areas. And we mentioned here how we need to start Russian language outlets, but what we need perhaps more in Georgia would be ethnic media, because our minority audiences speak Azerbaijani, they speak Armenian, and they prefer to read about their needs and interests in their own ethnic languages. That's why we have some very good experiences. Right now I'm talking about USAID program, but some of the EU interventions as well, building capacity of regional media outlets, and I think the same strategy needs to be applied to minority media support. And on a more broader level, I urge our donors to reassess some of the founding principles, like more for more principle, which is part of the strategy, overall strategy in the Eastern Partnership. And I don't think that this principle serves well to improve the information space in our countries. This principle calls for greater programming in progressive environments, whereas we see massive propaganda target those environments that have underdeveloped democracy in media, and then the sentiments and those lies are spreading across borders. So when I said multifaceted response, I meant geographically as well. Georgia which fortunately is a leader among the 6 countries, does need support, but equal, if not more, support needs to go to Azerbaijan and Belarus, because we are not insulated by our own borders. And this information is, somebody called it, compared it, used the metaphor of nuclear radiation. It's everywhere. Once it starts, no one's insulated, not even traditional and very strong European democracies, and we mentioned that as well. I want to draw your attention to public broadcasting, and we've made some kind of good strides in that area, but I think public broadcasters are responsible for providing reliable information to all strata of population and in all languages, and donor support to public broadcasting in Georgia, for instance, has built their capacity, but probably has done not much to increase their independence from political powers, or moreover have not done much to increase their leadership on the broadcast market. Because if we help public broadcasters, but their rating is very low and they are not popular and they do not provide interesting and engaging programming to the audiences, then the whole purpose is lost, essentially. On a note, back to the literacy and education dilemma, everyone knows that stronger education means more filters, more critical filters, and better defenses from propaganda, but some people think it's a long-term solution. I would respectfully disagree, because educated professional journalists and educated and literate audiences are less vulnerable. It is important to invest in literacy and education programs, be it in professional journalism programs, through media literacy programs in school and university level curricula. I know that Soros Foundation is experimenting with literacy classes at Georgian schools, so I think that is very important. But media literacy is useless unless there is greater openness about media sources in themselves. So literacy, I mean, how would you can be critical to a media outlet unless you know more about its owners? We in Georgia made it into law to be transparent about ownership and even financial streams in the broadcast media, and I think this is a good model for other countries to follow, because transparency is important, and not only in the broadcast media. We see some of the propaganda spread by news agencies or online news agencies, and they don't even bother to have a about us component on their websites. So how would we urge people to be more literate and more critical when they cannot even access information? So I think we need to have ways to self-regulate there as well. And finally, on the funding matter, we said several times that we should not possibly, could not possibly expect manifold increase in funding, but we, on the other hand, see massive investments messing up our information space from Russian, I'm talking about Russian investment, obviously. So we cannot, but we'll have to increase amount of funding allocated to media programs, and EU has not been the kind of media programs by EU have been underfunded, shall we say. So, but I hear you, and I want to reiterate that efficiency of expenditures is important as well. And I also want to reiterate how somebody earlier said that it's important to increase accessibility of EU funds, because if it's through kind of very, very massive bureaucratic hurdles, then EU funds would really make not as much as difference as they should. And finally, one of my colleagues, now my colleagues said how we need to be meeting in fora like this more often, and we need to do more more of regional linkages and partnerships, because like we remember, Eastern Partnership is premised on linkages and relations and joint programming among the countries, starting from radio bridges and ending with maybe sharing formats for programming as well. So I think that that is important, and with that I commend organizers of this conference for bringing us together and for allowing us to express some of our ideas, but more importantly hearing other important ideas as well. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much for this excellent wide overview on different areas where we need to do more, and your specific reference also to local and ethnic media, that there is massive investment going on which can crowd out the efforts which are made by much more limited private investments in your countries. That is evident, and that is a challenge, of course, for all of us. The colleague from the European Commission who is in charge of the programs which the European Commission runs has right now left the room, but will certainly be back to answer questions which you may have about these programs. I would like to pass on now to Mr. Aidan White, who is the director of the Ethical Journalism Network and a long-time former Secretary General of the International Federation of Journalists. He, of course, sees the challenges for media freedom and for the work of journalists across the world, and can put perhaps the whole thing into perspective. Where should we focus the efforts on?
Thank you very much indeed. First of all, I'd like to apologize to the meeting, but also to the colleagues earlier this morning that I was delayed in arriving because of a problem with flights. But I'm really pleased that I have been able to make it. And I've also enjoyed hearing what my colleagues have had to say here. I mean, when we talk about the way forward, I think I would agree absolutely that we should start from an understanding that the information challenge is everywhere. Look, there is no moral high ground anywhere in Europe when it comes to dealing with the crisis in media. Problems of political interference, problems of undue commercial pressure, conflicts of interest, lack of responsibility in journalism and in media and in ownership actually exist everywhere. And I think those threats where we have media ownership increasingly partisan and driven by political or commercial objectives have created a crisis also which was referred to earlier, a crisis of confidence in newsrooms across Europe. The Ethical Journalism Network, which I'm director of, was established by media professional groups, particularly to counter this drift towards a valueless system of media and journalism, and to try to promote ethics, good governance and self-regulation. And not just in traditional media. I believe it very strongly, and I think it's true, and it's something which I think policymakers, when they're considering the way forward about media information communication policy, should think about that ethical journalism can be an inspiration for responsible communications across all of the public information landscape. The fact of the matter is we have to combat corruption and conflicts of interest which exist inside media. That's clear. And we have to build public trust in journalism, and particularly by focusing on the need for much more transparency, much more ethical behavior and good governance inside media, but also taking up the challenge of self-regulation, which we heard about earlier. The question of self-regulation is not just a matter of creating national councils, press councils or media councils, desirable and useful though they are. It's about seeing media houses themselves, as Tarmu has talked about, creating their own internal systems which will build public confidence. It's also about empowering individuals to act and have the freedom to act according to conscience. Individual journalists and media professionals should themselves be able to put their codes of conduct into practice, should be able to act without retribution if they are defending their work. And issues like hate speech and propaganda really in the end are only going to be defeated by creating a solidarity both within the media sector and within journalism, and also with the public at large, at national and at regional level. And it seems to me that this is the challenge that we have to deal with today. I want to get back to sort of the practical issues that have been outlined, Chair, in this panel, and the way forward and so on, and what the European Union can do. Now, the European Union obviously represents all sorts of opinions and different views. Goodness knows, we know that very well indeed. It's a struggle to see how the European Union actually comes to a sort of clear, concise and appropriate decision at times because of the different interests at work. But there is a basis for what the European Union does, and that are the charters and the treaties that have been signed by all its member states, committing to press freedom, committing to free expression and so on and so forth. And I do think that in recognition of that responsibility, the European Union institutions need to realize that there needs to be more funding and more focus in the way that European Union funds are used to support media and journalism as important public institutions in terms of building democracy in the region. I think, for example, supporting media dialogues in order to deal with confrontations. For example, the OSCE has an interesting and important program of media dialogue between Russian media and Russian journalists and Ukraine media and journalists and so on. Cross-border dialogues which actually try to deal with the question of how do we call ourselves ethical, how do we call ourselves democratic when we see around us all of the time propaganda, manipulation, direct interference in the way that we work? We need to talk to one another about the practical examples and what we need to do to confront that. We need to do it not just in terms of Russia and its relationship with so many other states in this region. We need to look at it also in terms of the Balkans and so on. Secondly, I think the European Union activities needs to be much more focused on practical actions to provide tools for media and journalists to be able to combat manipulation and lies. Providing ways in which there can be more effective training on issues such as ethics, good governance and self-regulation. Very often these are just words which actually people on the ground discard because they say it's not relevant to the appalling conditions in which we're working. And I think we have to take that up as a challenge. In fact, it is possible, it seems to me, through good training to be able to develop a media community and a journalistic community which is genuinely confident and able to support one another in trying to put into practice the values and ethics which they support. I mean, it really is a matter of seeing these issues not as being academic or theoretical issues, but that they can be supported by practical actions. And we are working both with the EU and groups like UNESCO and the OSCE and so on. And there is really much a willingness, I know, within the media professional community, among owners, among journalists, among organizations committed to media development, to work together to try to develop these issues. Finally, I want to sort of deal with this question of funding of journalism and media content. Of course, it's true that in the best of all worlds, we would have the continuing balancing act, as there always has been, between the input and investment of private sector in journalism and the need for public funding and so on. But there is a reality which we're trying to live with and to grapple with in all parts of the world, and that is that today journalism does not generate huge revenues and profits. Journalism at its best, actually, is very often a not-for-profit activity. Actually, it has to be, because very often it's dealing with minority issues. It's dealing with issues which actually are not popular issues. It's dealing with issues which advertisers are not going to flock to want to be associated with and so on. So therefore, we have to recognize that funding of journalism and media content that is desirable and necessary for pluralism and democracy is an urgent issue, which I think the EU has to address. Now, it may well be that the future will see us, in the coming years, looking at completely new structures and new rules in order to fund the journalism and information that we need. But we need to start talking about that now, We need to start thinking about what will this new landscape look like. The reality is it's changing. For most of the people in this room, you remember what it was like before the internet. But I know there's a new generation coming through in which the traditional media and the traditional ways in which we receive and disseminate information are yesterday's world, about which they know little and they don't want to re-engage with. So we have to sort of think in those terms, much more open and bright about what we need to do. What absolutely is clear is, and this is my final point, is that we need not to throw out the values and the standards of democracy that have been established over the years in building the media freedoms that we enjoy today. And secondly, we need to promote, above all, media solidarity. Media owners, editors, producers, directors, journalists, media development groups, academics, they need to work together much more effectively in order to set this agenda and allow it to be sort of further developed. If the EU can make a contribution to promoting such dialogues and promoting such solidarity, it will certainly make an enormously important contribution to the future. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think you have very impressively shown this double challenge. On the one side, a whole profession in a massive change, the way we communicate, the way a journalist works. And on the other hand, at the same time, we have the challenge in our partner countries of a young profession and a young media freedom, or an endangered media freedom and non-existent in some cases to a certain degree. And the combination of the two make it difficult. And then the question of the public intervention, which frankly there is not a tradition indeed in the EU to fund media support as we would support concrete actions in the field of energy or environment, for example. What is there is that there is increased readiness to fund more effective communication efforts, which either directly or indirectly support the spreading of the EU message. And of course, using that, we could perhaps engage in some more innovative activities. And I would like to refer to the presence of Undersecretary here, who is the director of our Director General for Neighbourhood Policy and Enlargement, and who is in charge of the new regional communication program, Open Neighbourhood, which will be launched later this year, and where we have a significant increase of funding for a number of different media professional training and support activities, support to media productions, and support for communication activities on EU programs and activities. And there's the old approach again with the second indent. And perhaps, Alice, you could say something about this in a moment. I would also like to greet the presence here of the colleague from the cooperation, from the Council of Europe, with whom the EU does cooperate very closely. And we are addressing together with the Council of Europe the many challenges of the information society, and this more in the context of the framework to guarantee the freedom for the exercise of the profession you are talking about, which is so fast changing. So we have had, I think, quite a good comprehensive coverage of the challenges and of possible responses. We would like to become more interactive. So far, I have not seen that the colleagues at the panel have strongly disagreed with each other. They have rather, in very complementary ways, covered different aspects. So I would like to pass the word to you to come forward with your comments or questions to the members of the panel. The first one is here, please. If you were so kind to identify yourself at the beginning.
Yeah. Thank you for giving me the floor. My name is Tamara Chergalishvili. I come from Georgia. I'm the director of independent media organization like Tabula. We are present on the web. We just stopped producing the magazine about several months ago, and we also run the TV. Well, for 2 days now we're talking about the ways how to confront Russian propaganda, and at this particular event we're trying to identify the challenges and the ways how the donor community can address those challenges. Well, as Maia has rightly mentioned, like my sort of, not exactly the colleague, but a colleague from Georgia, in Georgia Russian language propaganda is not as much of a problem as Georgian language Russian propaganda and the tools of Russia's soft power. One of the strongest tools for Russia's soft power is, unfortunately, Georgian Orthodox Church. Georgian Orthodox Church is the most popular institution and most influential institution in Georgia. The problem with the, well, the Patriarch is quite ambivalent, and he's the most popular person in Georgia. He enjoys like 87% of popularity according to recent National Democratic Institute commissioned poll. Well, he's quite ambivalent in his messages. One day he may say that Europe is our destination. The second day he may say that, like, by sending our children to Europe, they are losing, for education, they're losing their identity and their religion. So, but as for the other clerics, I mean, they're quite open in spreading anti-Western messages, like through their constituencies or whatever. Yeah, and here comes the problem. Like the television companies, especially big mass media, commercial TVs, they're not willing, either because of their editorial line or because of commercial reasons, to confront Orthodox Church. And here comes like the, sorry to bring my example, but we run a TV which has which is confronting the church, apart from the government, on those issues. We have a program that it's called Talks on Religion, that advocates for rights of religious minorities, different minorities, and is criticizing the church for attacking other denominations. For 2 years now, we couldn't find any funding, and so my my idea is that donor community should be helping those programs that cannot be economically self-sustainable. Mr. White was just speaking out of my heart, when he mentioned that, because there is no way businesses will be willing to place an ads in the programs that is confronting the most popular and influential institution in Georgia. So that's my point. Sorry for making a long comment.
Okay, would you like to direct your remark to a specific member of the panel, or would you just keep this as a comment? Good. Then we proceed, please. Fourth row.
Thank you very much. Volodymyr Yermolenko, Internews Ukraine, Media NGO. I too have a comment rather than a question, because before this conference, a group of Ukrainian journalists just discussed some ideas how the EU can help, and we developed a certain number of ideas. If you're interested, we can share it with you. But just a few points. Editors. The key thing is editors, because journalists are on the ground for Western media. We don't have good communication with editors, probably networking with editors of EU-based media. All these ideas are really cheap to do. Not, you don't need to invest lots of money, but using existing channels. The second thing is that experts. Russians are traveling across Europe with their lists of experts, who to invite to a TV show in Germany, in France, etc., in Britain. And for example, Ukrainian media are also developing their set of experts, but we sometimes need money to go to Paris, to Berlin, to London, to spend a week there for networking. Second thing, exchange of content, what we discussed yesterday, is Ukrainian media producing up very nice, good content about Donbass, about Crimea, etc. Why not setting up a certain platform leading Western media to translate them, to adapt them? And that's it. You don't have to establish a new channel, whatever. Exchange of documentaries, very important thing. Exchange of video. Reviving Eastern European studies. We lost Eastern European studies, like a scholar field. It's very important to give grants to Western scholars that will go to Georgia, to Moldova, to Ukraine, spend a month, 2 on the ground. Because in Western Europe, our events are commented by Slavists who are mostly specifying on Russia, not on other countries, not on our countries. It's very important, reviving Eastern European studies. There is a great Ukrainian initiative, Stop Fake, yeah? Very often quoted here. But it's not only enough to criticize fakes or to disclose fakes, it's important to criticize discourse, to show the problems of discourse, of hate discourse. In the West, people don't really realize that this is a great war, information war, against the Western civilization as a whole. So we come with an idea of something like Stop Hate, which would bring the examples of Russian media just, romanticizing nuclear strikes. Nobody in Paris have seen Dmitry Kiselov with his famous program. So this is just examples, and they are very cheap. You should not have lots of money for that. Let's think about it together.
Thank you very much. This is very much appreciated because it's very concrete and it helps us to move forward. And I would be delighted if you could formulate this also in a way that we can take this with us from this conference. I would like to continue here. First row, please.
Thank you. Milica Pešić, Media Diversity Institute, London. 2 suggestions. One, it's 21st century Twitter time. Can people really speak using Twitter formula that everyone can talk? Question for Maia. Maia, there used to be actually minority language programs on Georgian national television when it was being transformed. What happened with that? Is it the lack of the international donors, such as the European Union? And that's the second question. Could the donors have a bit more longer commitments to the ideas? You cannot have a program which is, or objectives, 10 years programs, the EU, and expect a local implementer or any to do it in 2 years. Maybe that's one of the problems why ethnic minorities in Georgia don't have a voice right now. Thank you.
Okay, the last one in this first round, please, with the white jacket. I very much liked your appeal to the Twitter period in which we are living. So if everybody could start to be very much to the point and rather concise, please.
Radka Bečeva from the European Broadcasting Union. I would also like to comment just on the comment which was now made by Milica and on what Maia Mikashavidze made regarding public service media. Indeed, reforms in public service media need a very comprehensive and long-term and serious approach. It cannot, independence of public service media cannot come overnight. It needs a consolidated efforts of the international community. European Broadcasting Union is a professional association of 74 members from 56 countries. And we are doing a very extensive work also in Georgia, where we are providing strategic consultants, but really it needs a consolidated approach of international community. Council of Europe, European Commission, we are doing a joint project in the Balkans, and results are also already there. If we join forces again in the Eastern Partnership countries, I'm sure that we would have feasible results. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. We will do a second round because I was just told by the chair that we have 20 more minutes. In other words, we can go beyond 16:15 until 16:30. I would like to ask colleagues on the panel who would like to take up any of the comments which were made. We start perhaps with Mogens. Yes.
Yes, thank you. I would like to emphasize 2 keywords, patience and long-term. It has been mentioned from some of you, and it struck me when Mr. Tarmu talked about the long-term in introducing self-regulation and press councils and that. In Denmark, we, as Union of Journalists, it took us 30 years to engage in press councils. In 2004, I was in Belarus, first time, and we introduced a project in Belarus. Our Belarusian colleagues, they are still patient. They are still patient. It is such a long-term way to improve the situation in Belarus. Just heard about public service. It's long-term, and this is really a message to the donors and a message to EU. When you engage in these things, make sure that it's long-term, and tell all the organizations who are involved in this that it's all right that it is a long-term. That they has to be committed for a longer term. If you don't have the patience, if you cannot be committed for long term, we will fail. There are some countries where we went to years ago, but we went away again too early. Some of the countries where we're in now, for instance.
Thank you. Next one, your neighbor to the right, please.
Okay. Yes, thank you.
Tarmu.
Some of the comments included the word networks, the use of networks, like the colleague from Ukraine, for example, and some others. And also in the description of this session, we have a question like, what role can professional networks play in improving overall media standards? And let me just give you one example about the World Organization of News Ombudsman. We are being approached actually more and more by media companies in countries which don't have an ombudsman, and they say, we'd like to learn about how to become an ombudsman, because you can learn to become a journalist at a journalism school or university, but you cannot learn to become an ombudsman anywhere, media ombudsman. So we decided last month to launch a course, a week-long course for new ombudsmen. And we will be doing it regionally in Europe. We have interest from Africa because we are a global organization, and in some other places. From Egypt, for example, people said that they'd like this course to be in Arabic, but that's too premature at this point. But anyway, we do need this kind of networks, because some of the positions, like being editor, or particularly being a media ombudsman, are in a way a lonely position, that you do not really have someone to consult. You must take your own decisions kind of in a single room only. So that's why the professional networks should be encouraged by donors as much as possible.
Thank you very much. Another comment from Aidan, please.
Yeah, just very quickly, 3 points I want to make. First of all, on the question of religion, and I think this is really important. A lot of the problems that media content actually deals with, for instance, hate speech and propaganda, that is actually not generated inside media. It's actually journalists and others reporting political speech and religious speech. So we need the political community and the religious community also themselves to be responsible in their public communications. And I think, therefore, it's very important to try to engage in dialogues between media, religious leaders, and political leaders to try to weed out and isolate and eliminate that problem of hateful speech and hateful public discourse. I should say, actually, just a few weeks ago, an new international network has been set up for faith-based media and journalists. So journalists and media who are working in the religious area, doing the religious reporting and so on, are themselves getting together to try to deal with these questions. I think it's quite important. Secondly, the question of editors. Contact with editors is absolutely vital. But contact with editors is only going to be meaningful if the editors are independent. If the editors are genuinely independent. One of the big critical problems that there is these days is that less and less do we see the strong editor, the staunch defender of editorial independence. We see more and more the person who's essentially the editorial representative of the managing director, the person who's representative of the owner. And we see more and more the introduction of what you might call owner editors. That is to say, owners who have no fear about walking into the newsroom, taking control of information and so on. And this is a sort of major problem. But I think the need to reinforce the notion of editor, That is to say, someone in a newsroom who is absolutely critical to the defense of editorial independence is extremely important. And the third point I wanted to make is on the question of public service media. Look, I really genuinely do think that we need to be rethinking now the whole question of what is public service in media and information and so on. We've had a tradition of public service broadcasting which has been fantastically important and valuable, but that is changing, and we have to now be thinking of, you know, in view of the way, the revolution that's taken place in the way people receive and disseminate information. In fact, in the coming years, the television and the radio itself will become less and less the first tool that people go to receive information and so on. So therefore, I think it's much more important, rather than thinking of we have to protect existing institutions, to be thinking about how do we investigate and develop new forms of rules and structures that will allow public information, good journalism, whether it's been produced by NGOs or whether it's been produced by other groups, actually to be able to sort of gain access to these funds. And I think, therefore, we need to sort of just rethink what we mean when we talk about public service information.
Thank you very much. And now a short answer to a short, precise question on Georgia.
Yes,
Maia, please.
Thanks for the question. We all know downsides of project-based funding, and project is on, and ethnic media programs are on television, and then project ended, and those programs are off screens. That's, of course, problematic, and I do think the same, that there are certain programming which it is impossible to find advertising support for, be it religious issues or ethnic issues. Therefore, these are the kinds of programs that need most donor support. But on the other hand, it is very important that these programs are very engaging and they are built in the project. That program is such that public broadcaster would have less incentive to put it off television once the project is over. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Before opening the next round, and we will start this time on the left side of the House, I would like to ask my colleague, Andrés, to say a few words about the new possibilities under the new enlarged program of the European Commission, the Open Neighborhood Program.
Yeah, thank you, Gunnar, for giving me the floor. In the given minutes, so I would be very prudent to make any far-reaching financing or funding commitments. But one should be aware that the very fact of this conference, in the context of Eastern Partnership Summit, shows how the European institutions are serious about the role of media within this Eastern Partnership policy. So we are very carefully listening to the discussion today, to challenges, issues, grievances brought up by the participants of conference, so that we are able to use our tools at our disposal effectively to address these issues. As a first step, in terms of more ambitious media support within the framework of Eastern Partnership policy, I think we have to adjust our existing tools at our disposal. So, but on the other hand, funding is a crucial issue. I'm dealing also with the development of civil society and its support, also in the so-called enlargement countries. And recently I learned the situation in one of them, that if there were no EU funding, the human rights-based organizations wouldn't be able to sustain at all. And I think this is a very abnormal situation, because EU assistance is normally meant to complement national efforts. And these national efforts, as earlier today the Minister for Culture of Latvia, Madam Melgaile, spoke, so not always require a lot of funding. So in terms of adjusting regulation, which is a major problem in a number of countries, so it costs just of financing an expert from the Council of Europe advising on these issues. Having said this, I'm getting back to our existing assistance tools. And Gunnar already a couple of times mentioned the open program, which is meant to be at the regional level communication program. Up until now, we have trained up to 750 journalists in the eastern neighborhood to communicate EU and its policies. So I think it's a quite impressive number, but I think we need to maximize benefits from this training. And again, the key word was mentioned several times during today, to set up a network, to maximize benefits, to tap a resource, in fact, where we have already invested into. But for the future, we of course will continue with the training of journalists in the eastern neighborhood in the same ambitious way regarding numbers. But again, so I think we have to make it adjust and make more effective. First, for instance, approaching public broadcasters, taking young journalists from there to train so that our messages reach broader public, so approaching established commercial broadcasters, approach the journalists whose working language is Russian, and of course not to forget new and independent media. For this, there is this the so-called open program, which will be started pretty soon this year. That's on the open program. Of course, other forms of support might be considered as well. The notion of solidarity was very strongly present in the last session. In the Eastern Partnership, we have the so-called civil society facility. In order to promote solidarity within media community, I think we have to think how to more support journalists, professional organizations, either associations or unions. Because up until now, what I have seen on the basis of my personal experience, where these organizations are stronger, where there is certain solidarity within the media community for the sake of common goals, where they are able to engage in a dialogue with the government on relevant issues. Dialogue was also mentioned. So there is a hope also for improvement regarding the current situation. But as I said, so in the given minute, I'm very carefully listening to with my colleagues in the whole from External Action Service and from the European Commission, so in order to have ideas for future assistance.
Thank you very much, Andis, and keep his name in your memory. That's where the funding source is. So, 1 and 2 on this side, and then we take 3 more on that side, and that's it, because we need to finish in time. Please, here.
It's Alex Grigor's Baltic to Black Sea Alliance. Part of the challenge or the difficulty of dealing with the challenge of the Russian information aggression in Eastern Europe is that it takes Western values or Western journalism values and turns them inside out. For instance, in the U.S. and also in the European Union, it is well, both sort of federations are wary of funding media. I think public funding is prohibited in the U.S. For media within the U.S. Well, that's the latest I heard. But European Union is also sort of wary of such funding. But Russia funds unashamedly its propaganda factories such as Russia Today, often at the expense of the well-being of its own citizens. So that's kind of point 1.
Can you please make the point 2 in a Twitter style, in form of a Twitter style question or comment?
Okay.
Because otherwise your colleagues will not have the possibility.
Yeah, point 2 is hearing 2 sides to to a conflict. Very often it's hearing murder and its victim in the Russian sense. I mean, in the Russian media. And then every opinion, every newsmaker's opinion should be worth reporting. And that's, again, should we be interviewing separatist leaders in eastern Ukraine? And then should we be, we been reporting what Osama bin Laden wanted to say, or some other terrorists?
Okay, thank you. There was somebody else on this side? No? Then we go to the top here, in the middle, the gentleman with the beard.
Thank you. I have a question to the panelists and maybe to the other panelists. Previously in the morning, Tatiana Repkova mentioned the conception of multiple interpretation of journalistic truth. Also here was mentioning that there is a valueless system of journalists. Maybe it's high time to rethink, to make the new revision of news journalistic standards, because we are taking now this journalistic positivism as for granted, and sometimes it's used by Russian propaganda machine against the normal journalism. For example, the standard of balance is used against, for example, true coverage of the events on eastern Ukraine. So maybe it's high time to think about news standards in new reality, because the propaganda could use this against us. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think that's indeed the challenge. The abuse of and the perversion of established standards of journalism. We have two more, and then we end the session. You, the lady, and then the gentleman further up to the right. Yes.
My question is to Mr. White. You rightly mentioned that anti-Western propaganda is often mixed with hate speech, but in Georgian context, as a result of monitoring shows, not only clergy or politicians promote anti-Western statements and all kinds of phobia, but media itself, which is beyond any regulations, and there is no consensus on common values, and such kind of reporting is very profitable, while value-based reporting is donor-dependent. Where is the solution for this? And thank you for the work your organization is doing against hate speech. It's very helpful for Georgian NGOs to educate journalists.
Thank you very much for your short comment. The last comment or question, please.
My name is Andreas Metz. I'm an educated journalist from Berlin. I pretty much liked what the representative of Estonia said, that it should be the journalists who regulate themselves. And I'm not so much a fan of this idea of getting fund from the political side for journalists, because funds means always control. And in my opinion, getting money from the state or from the political side means fighting the Russian propaganda with Russian methods. My opinion is you should give a journalistic answer to the propaganda issue by forming a network of journalists all over Europe from the leading media. They should work on the propaganda, they should make research, they should answer this propaganda. It should be published in the main leading media all over Europe, if possible. It should be translated, of course, into Russian and also distributed via internet. But I think we need a journalistic answer to propaganda, not a state answer, not an official answer, not a European community answer. And my suggestion would to have the next media conference not organized by the European Commission, but by journalists. And there are also journalist congresses where you can address this issue. Thank you.
Thank you very much. This has, by the way, not been organized by the Commission, but we are hosted by the Latvian presidency here, and we're very glad to cooperate with the Latvian presidency in providing this platform. I would now like to invite colleagues on the panel for a 30 seconds final statement. In other words, you say things which can be easily used on Twitter. Arif, would you like to start?
Thank you very much. I will just remind you of two theses that were in my speech. First, the whole meaning of our efforts and fight is to keep the independent media. And it's very important in this fight to notice that independent media are living and dying. And this fight is now in totally different forms. What happened, for example, in recent years in Azerbaijan, and I know the same problem is in Armenia and in Ukraine. And second, the consequence. If there is no consequence, then this cemetery of wonderful and brilliant ideas will grow. And we will not have a wholesome and necessary media landscape, but some experimental field. So two things. In the basis, as the basis of everything, there should be the existence of independent media is the main issue, and first of all we need to help them, and then we have to have consistency in everything we do. Thank you.
Maia, please.
Thank you. Just very, very briefly, it's essential to support old-style, rigorous, strong journalism rather than pour money into communication programs, strategic communication, or any sort of new outlets that are not really about journalism. This is very important. And don't think that market will take over. Our journalists do not have funds to meet together and organize such conferences. That was my response to a colleague who advised against using donor funds for any fora. We are in desperate circumstances because we don't have enabling political and economic environment to engage in the kind of journalism we want to have.
Thank you. Ms. Bjerregård, Mogens, please.
We have to face reality, and reality is that there are not that much money in making journalism. Our response to propaganda is not to change journalism, it is to strengthen journalism. And to the question about media support is possible without thinking that then the state should decide everything in the media. Absolutely not. I emphasize that it must go hand in hand with absolutely independence and the principle of arm's length, and it's not in contradiction with self-regulation. I'm 100% in favor of self-regulation. It's, in my view, the only way to regulate media if you not go into the direction of state regulation. So self-regulation, absolutely, and face it, we need someone to be able to finance a pluralistic media market so we can have our democracy developed in a good way. And media and independent media is a prerequisite for democracy. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Tarmu, please.
Yeah, thank you. The question from the German colleague, yes, I do agree with you that state money, public money should not be used for propaganda, definitely for counter-propaganda. In the small case of Estonia, with ETV Plus, the new channel that will be created, it is created with the goal of producing local, unique content, which is not in the Russian language, which is not produced by the Kremlin organizations or Первый Балтийский канал or something like that. So it's a completely different concept. Yes, we do it because of propaganda war, but we're not going to be engaged in propaganda. That's the goal. And the question of whether we should be rethinking news journalism. particularly because of the propagandistic atmosphere around us. I think we should think very carefully, because if we feel unhappy about the way that those who engage in propaganda, they use our standards and our methods for their benefit, then we should not become like them. We should stay firm to our principles. And then, of course, we can always analyze what the internet does to news standards and stuff like that, but it's a different matter. Propaganda should not actually force us to rethink news journalism. Thank you.
Thank you very much. The last three sentences to Mr. White.
Well, first of all, I want to support that point. The concept of ethical journalism is based upon accuracy, fact-based communications, humanity, fairness, accountability, transparency. What would you want to change? It seems to me the question is, we have the principles, we have the values. What we want to do is to have the freedom to put them into effect. We have to create the conditions. Secondly, we shouldn't be intimidated by propaganda in order to sort of think that we have to counter by resorting to those methods. I think it's dangerous to sort of think in those terms. On public funding, I think we are confused about public funding. Public funding is actually the question of how we use taxpayers' money. And I think that using taxpayers' money to support systems for free exchange of information and communications within inside a society is not only not a threat, it is actually something that can promote democracy and good and civilized public discourse. That's what we should be talking about. So we mustn't regard public money as a threat just because there are many governments that actually use it for their own political interests. So we need to change our mindset on that. And finally, I would say it's true, Russia's investing a fantastic amount of money in propaganda through Russia Today and so on, but actually the US government is also investing and going to invest increasing amounts of money in its own public communications and strategies and so on. So every government has an interest, and we have to be sort of clear about that. But so therefore, to reinforce that the real point that we should be making is that we need the freedom to be able to work. The money needs to come from, if necessary, from public sources, but it should not come with political strings attached. It seems to me that that is always what we should apply.
Thank you very much for the clarity of your sentences, even though the last comparison of the one program and the other program may not be necessarily shared by everybody, but this will leave open for a debate over the coffee break. Thanks to all of you for a lively and very concrete and positive discussion. Thanks. Thank
you. Another announcement. Housekeeping announcement. So please be so kind to come back in 15 minutes. So we are starting the concluding session at 5 o'clock sharply.